What's up, everybody? Welcome to this year-end wrap podcast of the decade, Brewtally Speaking podcast, the official podcast of MetalNexus.net, where you can get all your show photos, concert reviews, and so much more. And with me, as always, for the last decade, is Daniel Terry. How are you doing this evening?
Man, has it been a whole decade? Wow. No, it hasn't been. But, you know, this is a lot of fun. I love this off-the-cuff stuff because I don't have to do anything. It's probably my favorite part of it. But yeah, it has been quite the year. We've talked to some really cool people. We've had a lot of stuff kind of open up for us. And it's been quite the journey.
It has been 2019 has been a very interesting year. You know, at the beginning of this year, we did a rebrand. We went from Johnson's Metal Podcast to Brewtally Speaking Podcast. We joined Metal Nexus, filling the large shoes that Joshua Toomey over at the Talk To Me podcast left behind when he vacated the podcast of Metal Nexus front. And it has been a wild fucking year.
Yeah.
I think we just kind of get into it. Like Dan said, this is basically going to be a free-form kind of look back at our year, and then kind of looking forward into what we're looking forward to for 2020. So right off the gate, you know, in no order, but like, I mean, I just have to say, this is probably the biggest thing to me where I walk away looking at, like, what did we do in 2019? What was, like, a big milestone? What was the biggest thing for me? And fuck it, dude, I gotta say it. It's gotta be the fact that the Blood Has Been Shed shit that we had happen from our show, not once, but twice. I mean, fuck, like, getting Howard Jones was fucking tight. But getting Corey Unger of Blood Has Been Shed, who, dude, hasn't been seen in over a decade, basically, and is a hermit, like, doesn't exist on the online anywhere, that...
Right.
I was so fucking stoked for that. Like, I'm just, and I know I cut it out of the last time we talked about this, but I'm leaving it in this time. Dude, straight up, Dan and I have an unreleased demo of the unreleased Blood Has Been Shed track. So all the talk of us going, I wonder where the band was going next. I wonder what the next shit would have sounded like. We fucking know. We know where it is. And let me tell you, you have no fucking idea how insane, how much more insane it gets. You just have no fucking clue.
Calculus 20.
Dude, this is... I am glad that I started a podcast, if for no other reason than the track that is sitting on my desktop right now, that I'll still go and listen to. And then we only got like a minute of a song. It's not even like a full fleshed out demo with vocals, anything like that. It is just a fucking raw track, scratch guitars. I think the drums are actually done in a studio, but it is insane. It is insane.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're not even selling it 100%. Like, it is. I would not have known how to make heads or tails of it, and it's funny too because he even gave us like a little message, kind of explaining to us, stuff to look for, you know, within that minute, and that actually helped quite a bit because I was kind of like, I don't know, you know, because to hear it in the unfinished state that you hear it, but then like you have to use your imagination to add everything else in there, and when you do, it's like, oh man, this record needs to come out. I don't care, you know, if we got to get like a Twitter campaign set or what, but
GoFundMe something.
Yeah, this record's got to. Yeah, like, dude, here's $30,000. You know, go do your thing. And if you record the entire record with only $10,000, then use the other $20,000 to go on tour.
Please. I think the thing that was most shocking about that is, you know, I think, you know, what's funny is like Toomey had Howard Jones on, I think about a year ago prior to this. And, you know, Light the Torch wasn't really, I think it was still Devil You Know at that point, honestly. And it was one of those things where, you know, Howard seemed very reserved. And I think Howard has done enough interviews, has been in the industry long enough that he just doesn't take bait. Like, if there's something you're trying to bait him into talking about, he ain't going to fucking take it. I mean, he straight up called Toomey out on it. He was like, you think I'm going to tell you that? Like, I don't know what you're doing? And then he just, like, avoided the question.
Yeah, that was pretty funny.
But the thing is like when we talked about Blood Has Been Shed, like I called him out on the fact that it's like, yo, you and Mike D are on record. I can't find the interview, but like you are on record saying like, yo, this record exists. There's music that exists. I have to just record my vocals. That was 12 years ago. Where the fuck is this record? And then like he was just like, well, yeah, the music does exist. And it probably won't ever see the light of day. Maybe Blood Has Been Shed will reunite before that ever happens. And the internet went fucking crazy.
Yep.
And it's one of those things to me where I have a Blood Has Been Shed hoodie, and some people are like, when people make the comment, they're like, that band's not as big as I think you think it is. And I go, no, I think it's bigger than you think it is. I think that band is more important than people really give them credit for being. And the fact that we not only went viral basically, not once, but twice, off of the same fucking shit means that people still want to hear Blood Has Been Shed. And to me, that makes me so fucking stoked that this show exists, that we were able to ask a question that fans have wanted to know the answers to for fucking 15 years.
That's one of the things that I like about doing podcasting on this show and my other show is just that we, at the end of the day, we are fans. We're not, weird gatekeeping, hypercritical people that are just trying to get the next big interview that's going to make us blow up or do anything to further our quote-unquote careers into talking into laptops. It really is just one of those, like, if I had Howard Jones in the room, or at least in the Skype room, what am I going to ask him? I'm going to ask him where that Blood Has Been Shed record is. Or like, was it ever made? Is it going to be made? Is it ever going to come? And that might be an annoying question, but I guarantee, based on his reaction, nobody has ever asked him that, at least not recently.
No, and that's the weird thing to me is, like, I feel like that would be, like, the Kill Switch thing has been beaten, like, I know we said this in the interview and on those episodes, but, like, the Kill Switch thing has been beaten to death. I mean, the what happened with Devil You Know, what happened with Light the Torch, I mean, that shit's been beaten to death. I mean, Granted, there's now more news on that front, and it is what it is. But as a very long-time fan of Howard, and you and I personally are going to be talking about old Howard Jones shit here very soon. I'm going to go ahead and spoil this because by the time this will come out, we'll have already recorded it. It may not be out yet, but discography discussion. We're doing Every Time I Die.
Yes, we are. Or have already done, sort of, maybe, kind of.
Episode 150. Obviously, if you know anything about me, that is one of my favorite bands. If you are a fan of discography discussion and you're listening to this show, that is one of the most requested episodes that has not been done.
It is. And, yeah, because that actually won't be out until after the turn of the year, so you're hearing it exclusive, and it's going to be really exciting. And we'll have John and Brandon Kellum of American Standards battle it out for who is the actual ultimate Every Time I Die fan. Well, that plug out of the way, check that episode out when it drops. It'll be, I don't know, probably we'll try to keep it under 8 hours.
I'm going for 5.
Okay, well, we'll see how it goes. And, $5 every time the word degent is said.
Ooh. Speaking of things that are said, what was one of your favorite memories of this year on the podcast?
Well, I really enjoyed our chat with Corey Brandon of Norma Jean.
Absolutely.
That was a lot of fun, and again, it really wasn't all that different than the whole Blood Has Been Shed situation, and that I had a lot of questions for him as a fan. Not as an interviewer, because like an interviewer, I yes, we do interviews on the show, but I never really think of myself as an interviewer because I'm just a fan, and I've gotten lucky enough to be able to talk to people that I'm a fan of, and so I ask fan questions, most notably, right down to misheard lyrics. And fapping, yeah, and like stuff like that, I just don't feel like you're going to get from a mainstream interview. And I really, I thought that he was just very kind and very generous with his time. I know a lot of the times when we get these interviews, it's like, 20 minutes, and this guy's probably been on the phone with other podcasters all day answering the same questions over and over and over again. How's the new album? Who recorded it? When's it coming out? Blah, 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 blah. And, we asked a few of those questions, but I feel like we really didn't ask a whole lot about the new material at all. It was mainly just stuff that I had always wondered about the band, and I had kind of come fresh off the heels of doing an entire episode on Norma Jean, so I definitely had those questions ready and in my mind. And yeah, the whole fapping thing was fantastic.
I think that's kind of the thing. Sometimes I don't think we really talk about this a whole lot, and it's not to discredit discography discussion in any way, shape, or form, because sometimes I feel like when people have kind of talked about your show, to me, they always kind of make it seem like there's this like weird competition between like, oh, do you feel like, Dan gives more to that show, or is there any like weirdness between all of you? And it's like, I think the fact that I've been on discography discussion as much as I have would prove that that's not a thing. But what's interesting to me is sometimes we have interviews and they're so perfectly lined up with the episode you will have just dropped within a week or two, to where all I have to do is, like, if it's not a band I'm familiar with and like Dan's not able to do the interview, I'll honestly use discography discussion as like some of my homework and research to be like, I value Dan and Joe's opinion and whoever else happens to be on the show that week. But it's one of those things like where I honestly think more podcasters should use discography discussion as a sounding board, because you're doing, like, especially if it's a band like, we'll go with In Flames.
Oh man,
In Flames has so much shit, and toward the end, that's literally what I'll say about it.
Yes, they do.
But like, I stopped after a certain point. Come Clarity was my last record. Like, after that, I was like, yeah, I'm done. But, like, thankfully, because of discography discussion, I don't have to listen to those other records to know that I was right with me leaving where I did. And I, as someone who just kind of just tries to do a decent amount of research, but without having it inform my opinions on things for when I do the actual interview or conversation, discography discussion has been pretty invaluable to me this year, because a lot of the interviews that we end up doing, you will have just done all the heavy lifting for me if I'm not familiar with a certain amount of the discography. And so for that, like, it's been great. Like, so the Norma Jean episode, like, yeah, you guys talked a shitload, you specifically, about that first record.
Yeah.
But when you finally got done sucking the dick and sucking the bones and the marrow of that first record, I was able to kind of gleam like, yo, I've told you, like, I saw the band on the Anti-Mother album cycle, and I was like, yo, this is like one of the worst shows I've ever seen. Granted, it was a Warped Tour set. It was the first band going on of the day, but like, I really had heard such high things about that record, and then I saw that band play, and I was like, this sucks. This is really bad. And I walked away being like, yo, this band's probably done. They're not good anymore. And it wasn't until I kind of really heard you talking about Polar Similar and like how much, especially Joe, how much that record meant to him and what he was going through at that time, that I was like, man, fuck that. Maybe I need to go back and listen to Polar Similar, give it a fair shake. Go back and listen to some of these other records that I wasn't giving a fair shake. And hearing so many, Brandon Kellum actually, talking about what these records meant to him as an artist who's actively in the scene and so forth, and you as someone who was in the scene and now is just an active music fan, and Joe going through some shit personally and what it meant to him on a personal level, I kind of realized, like, maybe I need to go back to look at these records and realize that maybe there's something more there for me to really look at. And to me, like, that was the cool thing about talking with Corey, is he kind of acknowledged all of our things and was like, yeah, some people fell off on these records, and I think we were putting out some of our best shit at this point. But I think by and large, Polar Similar is what is bringing casual and diehards together and being like, yo, this fucking record. And the fact that you were able to kind of be like, yo, like, my co-host went through a lot of real life shit listening to that record, and it meant a lot to him. That's a thing, like, where I was like, that's the cool thing about podcasting, is like, you get to tell these people one-on-one, and it's not weird, and you get to tell them these real life experiences and how it helps people. And I'm sure they hear these stories all the time, but this podcast potentially has the opportunity to reach a wider demographic, a wider array of people that maybe they're going through some shit themselves and they need to hear that record to get through their own shit.
Yeah, and I think something you said earlier that, you said, when I don't like to do the do the heavy lifting research beforehand so that it doesn't, paint my opinion of the band and stuff. So it's funny that you say I do the heavy lifting, because on discography discussion, I'm very much the same way. I like to just kind of listen to the records in a vacuum. Because one of the, and that way I can give like a real opinion on it. I mean, sometimes it's not possible. Like, it's a record I've been listening to for decades, so it's like really hard for me to separate the nostalgic feelings from, like current listening. But I think, one of the things that we get criticized the most for on discography discussion is that, that I don't do enough research on the bands. And part of that though is kind of intentional, because I want it to be, I want it to be more of in a vacuum of like, these are the records, this is what I was presented with. And I kind of like to put the pieces together right there on the episode, instead of having to worry about, like, okay, well, they changed guitarists here, or they went into a different sound here, or they went to a different label here. I like to let the albums kind of speak for themselves. And, but I also think that, as far as being an interviewer or a wannabe interviewer, is that, I kind of come to my questions from those opinion-based perspectives of listening in a vacuum. Number one, that has the added side effect of not, making sure I'm not asking people super personal questions, but keeping it about the music, but maybe coming at it from a perspective that other people maybe didn't think of or wouldn't think to ask. And so in that regard, I think, I really, it's not so much that I do the heavy lifting on the episodes as much as I just, I listen to them in a vacuum and I try to get an idea of what I think of the records on their own. And that does open up the door for me to ask, questions based on that versus, hyper personal real life questions.
Well, I think that's kind of been the nice trade-off for you and I is that, I guess we've never addressed this on the show, actually. You have told me when we've done these off recording, that basically you'll have people on Discord, you'll have people send you Facebook messages and so forth saying you have a different personality on this show versus discography discussion. And I honestly think more recently, I'd say maybe in the last quarter of the year, I feel like quote unquote discography discussion, Dan, has kind of come through a little bit more.
A little bit, yeah. Because it's that is something that people say all the time. They're like, "Oh, you're so much nicer on Brewtally Speaking than you are on discography discussion." And I think in the beginning that was more because I just didn't feel like discography discussion was being heard by as many people as Brewtally Speaking. And so and I don't know whether that's true or not. I honestly don't really pay attention to the numbers anymore. It used to be something that I used to kind of pool over and get kind of upset after a while, and it just kind of started consuming me. So I kind of just let that part of my life go because I just enjoy doing the shows. But one of the biggest things is that I really, it's not that I'm myself on this show or entirely myself on discography discussion. I think that it's a combination of both. Like they're like the middle ground is true. In the sense that, every now and again I will have a really strong opinion. Perfect example of that, like when we did the Cradle of Filth episode, and I probably gave you a good 30 minutes of being relatively neutral about Cradle of Filth and being like, and just talking about the chat, because I think that is important, regardless of what my feelings are about the band. They do have a legacy. There are still things to talk about. However, I still, for whatever, discography discussion, Dan had to pipe in at one point and say, I'd rather hear a new Cradle of Filth album than see blood in my urine. And it's definitely the middle ground is true. And it's so funny because I still get that question because people have gone back and listened to the back catalog, and I was a little bit more, I think, nervous on this show starting out, so I didn't want to say anything that was going to upset anyone or potentially hurt your downloads and your fan base by just coming on and making an ass of myself, in front of everybody.
But I think, like, to be fair, I think the same thing kind of applies to when I go on discography discussion, because what's funny is, like, if you go and listen to the handful of episodes I've done over there was the episode I did with the first one, As I Lay Dying, the infamous As I Lay Dying episode. And it's one of those things where, I had heard a couple episodes at the time, and I came onto that show thinking, like, yo, this is a discography discussion, so we are talking about the discography in multiple facets. And the reality of the thing is, sometimes, I mean, I think by and large, you guys don't go super, super, super deep like I was trying to on that As I Lay Dying thing, where I'm like, yo, isn't it crazy on the first 2 records, like, Jacob Bannon did the artwork, and you guys are like, yeah, that's cool, it has nothing to do with the records. And I'm like, oh, okay. But, like, to me, like, I was like, oh, it's crazy that, like, someone that's involved in, like, almost a grindcore-esque band is, like, putting artwork to this young and up-and-coming band and, like, talking about, like, the extremity of the music they were putting out at the time. Like, there were parallels I was looking to talk about, and then I realized when I mentioned that, you guys were like, yeah, okay. So it's funny to me that, like, I kind of had to learn the discography discussion format. And I think the same thing kind of applied to you coming over here. Like, you kind of had to learn what this show is. And it's funny, I recently went back and listened to an episode from way back, and I was like, oh God, this is bad. Like, the format isn't there yet. Like, I mean, say what you want about this, but I think that's the thing that's kind of interesting about some of these shows, between Toomies, between this show, between discography discussion and so forth, is kind of the growing pains of learning where the format comes. And especially with adding a co-host, there's a little bit of a growing pain of figuring out what the thing is going to be and how that works.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the hard part for me, when I first came on was, my name wasn't on the show. It was very much not... and this was not intentional. Like, you never said anything to make me feel that way, but it was, at the end of the day, it was John's Untitled Podcast. It wasn't Dan's Untitled Podcast, because Dan's already got a podcast where he can do his thing. And I think that's where I came from it, is I was like, look, I've already got my own outlet to do, whatever I want, more or less unchecked. So if I am going to come on and be on an interview, and it's funny too, because there is some weirdness in those first few interviews that we did. This is kind of going back beyond 2019, but like when we did the Jay Gordon chat, and like you're trying to have this serious conversation with Jay Gordon, and I was like, have you ever thought about doing a death metal album? Like and just stuff like that, and just weird questions that I would ask, because like one of the things that really helped me in 2019 on this show was relatively early in the year we did an interview with guitarist from Eve 6.
Yeah, John Sibbles.
And that was different for me because, like, of course, obviously we all know who Eve 6 is. If you haven't heard Inside Out, then you actually have. You just don't know that that's what it's called. And so like that was a really, really popular, it's not like we were talking to somebody that's huge or is huge now, but it was definitely hard for me to kind of stretch that muscle to kind of get out of metal a little bit and stretch my legs, because, whenever I really looked at it all, I was like, the only questions that I've got for people are like, is this album more brutal than the last one? What would you say the clean singing to screaming ratio is on this new album? Or, like I only knew how to speak in kind of metal terms. And I still struggle with that a little bit, especially with some of the artists we've had on lately where, John, you were very adamant about like, well, I don't want it to just be metal. And I think that was a little bit of a struggle, like a balance, because, we are the official podcast of Metal Nexus, and, but at the same time, it's like, I'm not going to pass up an interview with somebody I've always wanted to talk to just because it's on Metal Nexus.
No, absolutely. And who knows how this is going to pan out, so I'll just fucking spoil it, I guess. So, straight up, we were, it may still happen, we're 4 days from when this show is happening here in Michigan. I'm going to go ahead and assume, since I haven't heard back from the publicist, it's not going to happen. But straight up, we had an interview with Tiffany, the 80s pop star.
Yeah.
It fell through for a couple of different reasons, but I think that speaks to what Dan is saying, like, where sometimes I will just take things because I want to have interesting conversations with people regardless of the genre they're in. As you heard in the episode we did recently with Tommy Victor at Prong, where he's like, yo, like, I don't drink beer, so, like, I was a little nervous to do this interview. And it's like, no, like, brutally speaking just means, like, you're having an honest conversation. So the fact that, like, you know, I heard Tiffany on the Lead Singer Syndrome podcast, and I was like, she's awesome. She's, like, talking. She's, like, super sharing. She's having a good time. Awesome. Granted, if we did it, we were only getting 10 minutes, but I was going to make the best of the 10 minutes I had because, like, it would be interesting, and maybe it would lead to us getting some more people outside of what our quote-unquote genre is. You know, kind of something interesting, you know, kind of speaking to Dan and I kind of figuring out where Dan fits and all that kind of stuff, you know, over this last year. Something I thought was really fun was actually having Phil from All That Remains on quite a bit, as much as we did this year. And he actually was someone who made the comment, and unfortunately we just haven't had the opportunity to do this like we did for that one of the chats we did with Phil, where I Skyped Dan and literally held my phone up to Phil so Dan could basically ask him questions. And then Dan sent me his side of the audio, so it sounded like he was there with us.
Yeah.
And it was Phil going, that's, like, I was like, I'm sorry if that was weird or different or whatever. And he goes, actually, I think it's fucking smart of you to try to do that. Like, you should do that more. It's not that weird. And I was like, really? And that was, like, really eye-opening for me because I was like, I feel like it'd be fucking weird to have me like, hey, there's a guy sitting here on my bus with me holding up his iPhone going like, hey, here's my co-host. He's going to ask you some questions for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, and then I didn't. I was just like, yeah, so let's talk about this In Flames thing for a second, you know. and again, that's just one of those weird things where, you know, when you're trying to figure out where I fit in the podcast, and I don't necessarily know if I'm ever going to really fit, but I also think that's kind of part of the fun spontaneity of it is, all right, I'm holding my phone up to Phil from All That Remains. I don't know what Dan's going to say. It could literally be anything. And, you know, that was a lot of fun for me because I wasn't even wholly prepared for it either because I thought that, because we didn't know if it was going to work.
Yeah.
You know,
no,
like we had talked about it. And you're like, yeah, I mean, I can try to do this, and then, you know, if you're recording on your end, we'll have everything. And then he's like, Phil actually have my microphone in hand, so we'll have him local, so it'll sound like you guys are just talking to each other. And it turned out it was really seamless. And honestly, I kind of wish I hadn't even said anything about it and just kind of pretended like I was there, you know. But yeah, that was super cool. You know, one of the biggest things about this year versus last year was me doing solo interviews, which is something that I didn't ever think we were really going to do. Not because I can't do a solo interview, but just because, like, how do I sit down and do a solo interview and it be a Brewtally Speaking episode and not a, you know, a discography discussion or, you know, or something like that. And it helped kind of breaking in. I did like a 20-30 minute chat with John from Skillet, and that was a cool, definitely a big out of comfort zone kind of conversation. And but I think
can I cut you off right there and just ask you this? Did you approach it differently than maybe you would have if it was for discography discussion? Do you compartmentalize what you're doing for each show versus like a discography discussion interview like you've been doing recently versus doing something like that where you're like, I don't think Skillet is a band that maybe you wouldn't have talked about because I think it's in your wheelhouse, but it makes me wonder, did you approach it differently because of the show you were on, or at that point had you been like, I know what to do, like I've done a couple of, like, I mean, that Scott Mellinger from Zao episode, that was like an hour and a half of you just going off with like a friend. So to me, like when I kind of was asked, like, so you're handing this off to your co-host, and I was like, absolutely, he's gonna do really well with this. Like I had no doubts that you were gonna like knock that out of the park, because like I knew that was, even if you're not the biggest Skillet fan, the Christian rock world that you came into and know so much about, there's no way that you wouldn't be able to bring that influence into what you've done. So like I knew like I could let you do that, and my only worry was like, could you have a solid 20-30 minutes, because you admittedly you're not a 20-30 minute guy.
I'm not a fast talker.
Yeah, and like I wasn't either. Like that was something that I think this year, I think I became a really good 20-25 minute interview person. But it took me almost 3 years of kind of doing that consistently to get to that point. And honestly, I thought that skillet chat you did with John, I was like, yo, Dan can handle these 20-25 minute interviews and kill it. Like, it felt like longer than 20-25 minutes, personally.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to your original question, I really, I don't want to say I consciously was like, okay, Dan, this is not a discography discussion chat or anything, but, discography discussion is really different, too. Like, so for me, it's the location, because when I'm doing that podcast, I'm in a studio.
Right.
And, and Joe's there, and he's got me all mic'd up, and he's sound checking me and all that or whatever. And we kind of turn enough knobs to where everything's very smooth and comfortable, and, but with these, like for the John from Skillet, I came home from work on my lunch break and, did this, opened up my MacBook, and, John calls me on Skype, and, we start talking. And I think there's definitely, I think the approach was a little bit more of like, I know I've got 30 minutes, and I know that I have to cover at least 3 points that I didn't come up with, because spoilers, a lot of the times when we get these interviews, it's because the publicist is trying to promote a tour, or is trying
a record,
or both, and oftentimes both. And so, part of the agreement to have them on your show is to be able to cover those topics, but also be able to ask whatever you want to ask. It's like, that's the exchange, in that, like, it's kind of like on a record, you've got an A side and a B side, and the record label wants you to record 2 of their songs from their catalog at least, and then the rest you can do whatever you want, And so I kind of just approached it from that. It's like, I want to weave these bullet points in, and I also want to ask John questions specifically about Skillet, or about Christian music, and what their transition was from, Christian music acceptance only to more mainstream acceptance. And I guarantee you that if I was sitting down and doing that interview for discography discussion, I would not have even cared about any of that. Like, I would have asked him questions about Skillet or whatever, but this was one of those, like, I'm doing an interview, and I think that's the biggest takeaway. The biggest difference is that on this show we do interviews. Like, that is the bread and butter of the show. Like, personally, I think John and I are interesting to listen to, just us. But the reason people are listening is to hear that artist, and so that's just kind of how I approached it. But then at the same time, there are situations where that's not always appropriate either. So whenever you look at, like, the conversation I had with John from Circleback, that was not like a publicist kind of deal, or even the Wolves are closing in, where it was one of those, like, I had to incorporate a little bit more of that discography discussion lingo and stuff into those conversations in order to make them flow like conversations, because nobody at that time, and obviously hopefully this changes over time, but nobody would be going into that episode knowing who Circleback is, or knowing or knowing who the Wolves are closing in are, or so in an interview like that, it has to be like, let's find stuff that we have in common and then kind of talk about that. And I think those went all right. The John from Circleback ones, but those were longer podcasts. But in the upcoming year, I definitely would would be more interested in trying more of those 20-30 minutes. And there's also the ones that Jon and I have done together, which I think are the most valuable ones that we do when we're both on and we're trading on and off. And unfortunately, with Jon and I being in different states and it being based around our work schedules, a lot of the time makes it almost impossible for us to both be there at the same time and be plugged in. But man, whenever we are, it's awesome. There's only one time that it wasn't awesome, and that was the Howard Jones debacle.
That sucked. But I was so bummed because Dan and I did a lot of prep going like, yo, like, let's talk about these things. You'll ask about this. Then I'll come in and ask about this. Like, there was a lot of prep that went into it just for it to be an episode that you guys never heard. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was I really liked the Ryan from Demon Hunter one because anybody that listens to my other show knows that I'm not exactly what you would call a Demon Hunter supporter. And again, that episode is actually one of the reasons why I get so much of that. Like, you're so nice to the artists when you talk to them on Brewtallyspeaking. And then you'll do a episode of discography discussion where you're just like totally trashing the band. And, I'm like, well, first of all, I try not to trash them as individuals, I'm not like, yeah, this guy's scrawny and stupid and dumb or, stuff like that. But I just may not have liked his records. It even happens, there's nobody in the world where you like every single aspect of everything somebody does, but what was interesting about that one is because people thought, much like whenever we did the Phil Anselmo and the Illegals interview, people were like, "Oh man, Dan's gonna go crazy and say all this crazy stuff," and it'd be one of those things. It's like, well, first of all, every single living human being deserves respect to some degree, So yeah, exactly. Walk on home, boy. But it's definitely one of those situations where, like with the Demon Hunter one, I came away from that conversation being like, you know what? I liked all of Ryan Clark's other bands. I love Focal Point. I loved Training for Utopia, and I even like Knives. Like, Knives was really cool. I'm just really not into Demon Hunter. It's just not my thing. And it's not even necessarily that Demon Hunter's a bad band. It's just that I've been listening to metal for a long time, and Demon Hunter's one of those bands that, they're kind of a band you listen to if you're just getting into metal. Yeah. And I did ask that question, and he's like, yeah. He's like, well, it's totally what we are, And basically, I remember, because we ended up talking to Ryan for like an hour after we were done doing the episode, and all the stuff that he showed us and just how chill he was and generous with his time. It really was like, I remember getting off with Jon and being like, yeah, man, I'm not a big fan of Demon Hunter, but I'm a big fan of Ryan Clark as a dude.
Yeah, absolutely.
And definitely as an artist.
Yeah, something that was kind of funny about this year too. So, full transparency, probably shouldn't admit this on a podcast because, whatever.
Here we go.
Basically we're on point to do the exact same numbers we did last year. As far as downloads, all that kind of stuff. A couple of different subsects of our numbers, like YouTube has done better. We got more, subscribers, more views, all that kind of stuff. Spotify now is a thing that I think they only do their own whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, like this year, like, we cracked into the top 100 on iTunes for the music podcast. We multiple times cracked into the top 50. I think we were pretty close to the top 25 on Stitcher podcasts. So like we've done really well this year. But something I kind of want to hit on is just the diversity of some of the guests we've had. Like, we had Michael Beinhorn on this fucking show.
Right? Yeah.
Jesus Christ, the lineage that dude has had. Like, you've had Toby Wright on your podcast. That's someone I think really should do this show too, because like I think collectively you and I have a wealth of knowledge of what he's done that we could have a really great conversation with him. But we had some great producers on here, but like Michael Beinhorn is just fucking legendary. We have Will Putney on.
Yeah.
Like that dude basically has been one of the two go-to dudes in the last like 5 to 10 years. in the heavy metal hard rock realm. That was tight as shit to like talk to Will. And then, it's funny, I was listening to Lead Singer Syndrome podcast, and Shane, for his like 200th episode, this made me feel like a real motherfucker, had William Duvall on from Alice in Chains.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that was just an episode we did. It wasn't even like the 200th or the 250th. It was like, yeah, that was like 213 or something.
Right,
like,
right.
It just was what it was. But I mean, like, in the last couple of months, we've had William Duvall of Alice in Chains. We had Head from Korn. We had Ivan Moody from Five Finger Death Punch. Two of those three made pretty big headlines from some of the stuff on this show. And it's just wild to think, like, it kind of makes me feel, I don't know if conflicted is the word, but, like, where I'm like, yo, these are some guests where people are like, I'm holding these off for, like, the big fucking milestone episodes, and we were just like, yo, this was, like, episode whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's, it just kind of, I think, shows the growth of the show, and, I mean, full transparency, like, Ivan Moody was on to talk about CBD products, whatever, but he still is the singer of fucking Five Finger Death Punch.
Right.
William Duvall was on to talk about a solo record. Honestly, most people probably aren't going to listen to it,
even though it's actually really good.
It is stupidly good.
Yeah.
But it's still William Duvall, this singer of fucking Alice in Chains. Head is still the guitar player from Korn, and I don't care if he was on to talk about his movie. Like, that shit's on Showtime. It was, like, in movie festivals and so forth. Like, it was a big fucking deal.
I was super bummed out about that one, too, because that was one of those last-minute, can you get it in? And I was, like, at work really heavily, like, up to my elbows and stuff I was working on. And you were like, can you be ready in 40 minutes? And I was like, no.
Full transparency. Because this is the fun thing about doing these, like, year-end episodes.
Absolutely.
So I went to a bar, like, that's like a put your dick in the dirt kind of bar, like, strong drinks.
Yeah.
So I went out with my wife. I went out with some friends, like her couple of, like, lady friends and so forth. And we're at this bar. We're doing shots. We're drinking. I've been drinking hard for, like, a solid 4 or 5 hours before that Head interview.
Yeah.
And then I got that email. It's like, hey, can you be ready in, like, at this time? And I was like, oh, yeah, I can, because, like, I don't live that far from the bar I'm at. But full transparency, that was me, like, 3/4 in the bag.
Oh yeah.
When I did that interview.
Yeah, that's that. I feel like that's a skill that we both have. I mean, I can't tell you how many interviews we've done where we're feeling pretty good. Like,
yeah.
And that's something that I'd like to change, about myself. But I mean, it still happens every now and again, and you just hope you didn't say anything embarrassing when you go back to edit it.
I will say for the Head one, like, I definitely fanboyed out at the very end, but, like, I think for all intents and purposes, like, and this is something I sort of hope that as the show progresses, as we talk to bigger and bigger names and so forth, hopefully, I hope that I don't feel the need to have to go have some drinks to, like, calm me down and be like, oh my God, I'm fucking talking to so-and-so. But, I mean, for real, talking, like, if you being a mid-30s, a little bit older, a little bit younger, if you can't understand where I'm coming from, where I'm like, dude, I'm talking to Head from Korn, who I can tell you where I was when I heard that first fucking record. Like, Korn is a huge part of my growing up and coming into my own as like, finding my music. And I said it at the very end, like, dude, one of the first shows I ever wanted to go to, that my dad took me to, was a Korn show.
Right.
So, like, Korn is stupidly nostalgic for me as far as, like, what they mean to me. And the fact that Head and Monkey are rooted, as a shitty guitar player myself, that, like, I'm like, yo, like, I learned how to play blind. I learned, I have the Follow the Leader, tablature book and shit like that. I bought a 7-string because of those dudes. Like, what they mean to me as musicians, what they mean to me as a band and so forth. Like, the fact that I had someone on this show and was able to talk about, at the very, very end, like, dude, this is what you mean to me. Like, Jesus fucking Christ. No pun intended, considering it's Head, but...
Right.
it's one of those where I was like I remember telling my wife, I was like I think this is gonna happen, and I'm really fucking nervous to talk to him. Like, I know he's a dude, but like, it's Head from Korn. Like, what the fuck? Now, the other side of things, and Dan, like, because Dan and I were trying to figure this out together too. I'm I don't know if you could hear that. I am literally knocking on wood. So I was sitting in front of the computer I'm sitting in front of right now. I was supposed to talk to Jonathan Davis this year about his solo record when he was on the solo run. It did not happen. And it was like a week after the Head interview initially didn't happen. And I was like, dude, I was supposed to have two-fifths basically of Korn on this show to talk about, you know, not Korn things, but it was just like one of those things where I was like, this show has grown enough that like these things are really happening. Like, if you would have told me last year or the year before or whatever, like, yo, you're going to talk to someone from Korn, I'd be like, dude, that's like in 10 years, maybe I'll get to talk to someone from Korn.
Right.
Not 3 years into the show. Like, yo, you're going to talk to two-fifths of Korn. And it's like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
And that actually will lead me to kind of, you know, as we're slowly wrapping up now, what are you, because I know the shit that I'm working on for next year for us. But like, what are you looking forward to next year? Where do you see this show going next year? What are you looking forward to next year, and who do you hope we get to talk to next year?
Well, one of the things that I, you know, kind of envision is I want to do more long form interviews. Not all of them, because I know not everybody likes listening to long form interviews, but I do. I'm a big fan of that, and I would like to get to a level where maybe we could have some guests return that maybe we had only gotten for 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever, and really kind of get to dig into the nitty-gritty of things and them feel comfortable enough with us to talk about those things with, you know. Certainly there's been a few interviews, like with the Head interview, that I would like to at least like participate in. You know, Jesse from Killswitch Engage is one that I would love to do.
Might have to do like the Phil from All That Remains thing, where I hit you up ahead of time, because the second date of their upcoming tour is here in Grand Rapids.
Yeah.
Obviously knowing Josh, who is their production manager and so forth, and Amy, you know, putting in our hopefully best foot forward with Amy, the publicist of Killswitch. I feel like Jesse or Adam is a very strong possibility of a get for next year. And I fully, honestly, am prepared to Skype you in and do like we did for Phil and have you, you know, do, you know, a third of the interview or whatever. Like, it is a little tough to hold my phone while I'm trying to also like look at levels and do an interview and so forth.
Right.
But if it comes down to it, like I would love to try to do something like that, to have it feel like you're there in the room with Jesse and I.
For sure. Yeah, I definitely would be down for that. I think one of the things that I like to do, not only on this show but on my other show, is I like to showcase other podcasters too. You know, so yeah, I think it would be fun to get like a Lauren Kozlowski, or, you know, get Toomey on the show as in you know, in an official capacity, you know, to do an interview, glean some things from those guys. And I'm a very iron sharpens iron kind of guy. And like we had Scott Bowling on to talk about his stuff and, you know, what he does. And I think that whole interview was just us talking about podcast stuff, which might not be hyper interesting to you, the listener, but to us, it's very invaluable to be able to bounce ideas back off of each other. And if you are somebody out there that wants to start a podcast, you know, it's valuable information to get from people and find out, you know, what their style is. So, you know, but, you know, not even necessarily podcasters in our circle either. You know, it would be cool to have like a Josta on, or, you know, we've had Doc Coyle on a couple of times. And those are some of the interviews that I enjoy the most, because, you know, number one, it's mutually beneficial for both podcasts, you know, and it definitely, because there's a lot of people, I get messages from people all the time, hey, I love discography discussion, I just wish that there was more podcasts out there like it. And I'm like, well, I'm on Brewtallyspeaking too, right? And like, oh yeah, okay. And then, they'll check that out, or vice versa, get the inverse as well. And, I'm all about sharing the wealth, so to speak. And so that's something that I'd like to do a little bit more next year too, is kind of showcase some of those other podcasts that we listen to.
Yeah, I think in light of us teasing, me coming on discography discussion to do an Every Time I Die episode, you guys have had Toomey on discography discussion. You had Scott Bowling on to do the Morgan Rose episode. We've had Scott Bowling on here. Scott Bowling obviously has ties to Toomey. Something that I would like to see in the next year or so, I want to get some more producers on the show. One of my big bucket list producers that I would love to get on, and, it just, as soon as I say this name, everyone's going to be like, whoa, of course you're going to want him on. But, like, Ross Robinson is someone I'm going to bucket list. I'm going to...
Oh, yeah.
I feel like we know a handful of people that probably could get us there. That's someone that in the next year I'm really going to try to be like, yo, like, we need Ross Robinson on this show, like, to talk about a bunch of different things. I would like to get more producers on as a whole. In the event that we don't get Jesse Leach from Killswitch on, I'm hoping that as a quote-unquote consolation, which I don't see it as a consolation. I think if I get either of these two people, one or the other, I have completely different interviews ready for both. But, like, I would love to talk to Adam D about his production career and how much he has meant to the metalcore scene as it was kind of expanding and growing and becoming what it became. Because, I mean, shit, honestly, think about that late 90s, early 2000s metalcore, and Adam D was like Doc Coyle on a podcast, I think it was on the Kerrang podcast, talking about metalcore and all that kind of stuff and the legacy of the genre, where, he talked about End of Heartsick coming out and so many people basically trying to mimic that record from the sound to everything. And you can't look back on that time period and sit there and tell me that Adam D didn't basically inspire every record that came out in that genre to sound like a Killswitch record. I mean, going back to All That Remains, you go back to the Fall of Ideals, everyone's like, yo, make a Fall of Ideals too. That is basically, if you don't have the End of Heartache, you don't have the Fall of Ideals. I hate to say it, but I mean, even All That Remains say that in the fucking liner notes, like, thanks to Joel and thanks to Adam for giving us your guitar tone for this record. And it's one of those things, like, I just can't help but be excited to potentially talk to Adam D about putting his fucking thumbprint, his stamp on a genre and being a sought-after producer that had such a legacy in that time period as much as he did. There are a handful of people I'm looking forward to talking to. One of these I'll spoil now. This straight up has been by the time this happens, it'll have been 3 years in the making. But we are getting Jesse from Misery Signals on this podcast. And when that happens, holy shit, do we have a lot to talk about, because I have been working on that forever.
Yeah, you need to just let me know when that's going to happen. And don't make it like 1:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday.
No, that will straight up be, because of his living situation now, that will be, like, by all intents and purposes, for everything that we have sent each other over the course of time, since initially agreeing to do this, that is one where we will have a long time to be able to talk to him about everything. So, the amount of information about Misery Signals that I have been sitting on since the start, Dan has seen screenshots of my messages back and forth with Jesse to back this up. There's a lot of shit that, like, as the public becomes aware of, like, oh, Misery Signals is recording a new record. Oh, Misery Signals is going on these tours. I've known about them before they were even announced, and I just couldn't say anything about it.
Right.
So when I say, like, yo, Jesse's coming on this show, and we are going to hit every fucking thing that there is to talk about, we're going to go on a deep dive. Like, I'm expecting that episode to be 2.5 hours at least.
Yeah, well, that's fun because, going back to my long form, that's what I would want from that interview. So definitely looking forward to that.
So kind of in wrapping up, we've kept you for an hour at this point.
That we have.
I want to say thank you to, we've been getting a lot of new people on over the last couple of months leading up to the end of this year, 2019. Going into 2020, like Dan and I said, this started as John's Entitled Podcast. I didn't have a clever name for the podcast. I didn't even know what the podcast was going to be. I just kind of had an idea. I wanted to have conversations with people, and I wanted them to be interesting and cool and fresh and different. And what's been crazy about it is over this three plus year journey, it's brought me to, meet people like Dan who found the show because of, me finding Toomey or Toomey finding me, however you want to put that, and Toomey, being on my show, him having me on his show, Dan having me on discography discussion, and then meeting someone like Scott Bowling, and then, the Roach Coach people. Like I said earlier, I started a podcast because of listening to Kevin Smith and Chris Hardwick constantly saying, like, yo, just make your thing. Do something you're passionate about, and it'll never feel like work. And this past year, the podcast has been so incredible. We went to, not necessarily with Dan, but we went to Sonic Temple, one of the biggest rock and metal festivals in the U.S. And we were peers among iHeartRadio and some of the biggest fucking names in the industry. And it's like, yo, we're right here. We were handpicked by Danny Wimmer Presents to be here. And so next year, I'm hoping we get to repeat that. I hope Dan gets to go to, Dan and I get to go do a festival together, or, we get to do festivals that are near where we live and kind of grow our brand amongst other brands like that and just kind of get our name out there. But I'm excited to see what 2020 holds. I think we proved this year that we can be bigger than just, we're a metal podcast. We're more than that. I think we've shown that we can talk to producers. We've shown we can talk to people, TV personalities. We've shown we can talk to just each other, other podcasters. I think the potential for this show is limitless as long as we follow our hearts and our passions. And I think that's the thing that has me most excited about this. And the thing, honestly, some people have been have vocalized to me, it's kind of a bummer Dan isn't more an integral part of the interviews and so forth. And as Dan commented earlier, it's kind of due to our work schedule. It's kind of due to our personal lives. I don't have kids. Dan has kids enough for me and him.
Keep in mind, too, I do 400 podcasts.
Yeah, you do a bunch of podcasts.
Yeah, so that's the whole thing, too, is that, it's hard to... Honestly, I am reaching a point in my career, quote unquote, where some nights I'm just I just don't want to do this, and then I get back up on the horse and it's fine. But it's just one of those it's for the very first time it is starting to actually feel like work. Not in a bad way. Work can still be fun. You can still be passionate about what your work is, but it is still work. And I am hoping in 2020 I can get more solo interviews out. I can get more Dan and Jon interviews, going at the same time. But, I also have a pretty sweet deal here. Being a fan of the podcast, I get to hear it before anybody else does. And that's kind of my perk.
Yeah, something I would like to see more of is maybe we expand the podcast to be more just once a week or once a month or something. It's just an episode. It's just you and I commenting on a bunch of stuff. It's ever changing. It's growing. And I think the growth that we've had this year allows us the opportunity to go in a lot of directions. And I'm excited to see where those directions go. I'm slightly jealous of discography discussion because some of the things I would like to do, you're already doing, or potentially going to be doing. But something, I'm going to propose a couple of things for next year that I want to see happen. I would like to see a live podcast be done between you and I. Somehow I don't know what that looks like, how it's going to happen.
It's you pointing your phone at the audience with me on the phone. Yeah, no, I would drive out for that for sure.
It's potentially you and I going to St. Louis, and actually that's something my wife and I talked about is going to St. Louis for just a trip. So I don't know. There's plans next year for Dan and I to actually meet in person
There you go.
for once, as opposed to just looking at each other over Skype. Something I am passionate about. I posted this on my personal Instagram. I took a photo. So like I did the photo odyssey with Porter McNutt to Betray You, who's a photographer who loves, he does these things, these VIP meet and greet kind of things where basically he goes and teaches people how to do photography, look for things beyond just the initial thing you're seeing and so forth. And something in that. So like there was a hotel, we were going to a friend's hotel room, and there just happened to be 2 chairs at the end of a hallway right next to the elevators facing each other. And I was like, yo, that looks like a perfect podcast setup. Like one person's on one end, the other person's on the other, and you have a conversation. And it kind of looks elegant and so forth. And I just snapped a photo because I was like, oh, it's sort of the unspoken of what's not there is speaking volumes to what you're taking the photograph of. And so I took a photo of it, and I didn't know where I was going to post it, how I was going to relay whatever I was feeling about it. And then, I posted on my photo, I was like, next year, these are my bucket list guests. Like, I want to get Jesse. I want to get Adam from Killswitch. I want to get Jesse from Misery Signals. I'm getting, knock on fucking wood, we're getting Ice-T, goddammit. And, a slew of other people that I was like, yo, I want to talk to these people. Because when I looked at that photo, it made perfect sense for the podcast where I'm like, yo, we're on one side, they're on another. We're just having a conversation between the two of us, but we're sitting there, just us having a conversation. And I think that's the thing, in looking back on this year and looking back on the 3 years of this podcast, that's something that I feel like have done very well at, going to the Scott from Zayo, going from the Frankie Palmieri episode that we did, going to most of the episodes we did. Yes, it was sort of an interview, but I feel like by and large, it was more of a conversation of fans talking to people that they're excited to talk about the things that make us music fans. And I hope that we can continue that into 2020. And I think we're poised to do that. I think, what, the thing I'm most excited about, and I don't know how we're going to do this, but I'm throwing it out into the universe. I'm going to leave this in. I'm going to put it out there. I want Roach Coach. I want the Good Company with Bowling. I want the Talk to Me podcast. I want discography discussion. I want all of us to somehow make a network. I want us all to work together to building something bigger than all of us individually, but it's something that we're all passionate about. And I think if we combine all of our efforts, we can achieve something bigger than all of us. And it's something you and I, Dan, have talked about individually, unbeknownst to a lot of people. And I feel like 2020 is the year that we figure that out.
Well, let's hope it happens.
Discographydiscussion.com represents everything.
Right. Yeah. I'll be all like, yeah, I'm cool with forming a network, but I want everybody to be under my banner because, I'm such a big deal.
The Good Talking Company.
The good
discussion.
Toomey's Good Talking Company coach speaking. I don't know. Yeah, it'd be interesting. That is something funny. People always say they're like, yeah, they're like I checked out Roach Coach and I checked out BREWtally and I checked out Discography Discussion and Talk to Me and Good Companies. Like, you guys are like all in bed with each other. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's not completely inaccurate. So
I feel like that's the thing for 2020. That is going to be one of my biggest goals, is to get us all on board to create a network. Like, I listen to Jabberjaw Media. I listen to a lot of these other podcasts. And, everyone somehow is able to put aside their differences to work toward a greater goal, a bigger goal. And I feel like, you go to iTunes, you see one of our podcasts, you see every other podcast recommended, that it's like, it's stupid of us not to take destiny into our own hands to grow this thing to be bigger. And I just feel like, if we stop kind of fighting what's in front of us, we'll be more successful together than we will be individually.
Possibly. Not possibly. That's a true statement, so... I'm with you.
Well, for the Brewtally Speaking podcast to end 2019, if you would like to keep up with Metal Nexus, you can find them at metalnexus.net, Facebook at Metal Nexus, Instagram at metal.nexus, and Twitter at metal_nexus. If you would like to keep up with our show's sponsor, The Bean Bastards, you can find them at thebeanbastard.com. Facebook and Instagram are The Bean Bastard. And if you would like to keep up with On Point Pomade, you can find them at onpointpomade.com. On Point Pomade on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you use our code BSP15, you will get 15% off your total purchase. Let them know that we are sending you there. I mean, it's the holidays. It's the beginning of the year. New you, new do, all that shit. Keep your beard, keep your hair looking good. Use BSP15 to keep your look on point. And Dan will tell you right now where he can be found on the internet.
Oh, I can be found at discussmetal.com. I can be found on Facebook under Daniel Terry. I can be found on Twitter at DiscussMetalDan. I can be found on Gmail at DiscussMetalDan.
And if you'd like to keep up with all things this podcast, you can find us simply enough at BrewSpeakPod, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Check us out on BrewSpeakPod or Brewtally Speaking Podcast. We also have pins. If you would like to buy one, $15 gets you a pin shipped anywhere in the U.S. We'll cover the shipping costs. If you live outside the U.S., just hit us up, let us know, and we'll figure something out that works for everybody involved. If you would like to support us monetarily, head over to patreon.com/BrewSpeakPod. If you would like to support us non-monetarily, well, I mean, you can favorite, like, subscribe, whatever the option is on the platform that you are listening to this on. There is an option to support us in that regard. Do such. We would love you a long time. And for the Brewtally Speaking podcast, I am John.
And I am Dan.
Happy New Year!
Happy New Year!